talk about today. The Cutter story, George H.W. Bush died. George Herbert Walker Bush. Now, there, I'm sure, are many things you will see and hear about George Herbert Walker Bush this weekend, and I don't know how to continue with the way I've been expressing my thoughts about the passing of many of these people. When Ronald Reagan died, I was on the air in Los Angeles, and I said something that offended many people in Southern California. And at the same time, I stood by it, and many others were really happy I said it, because the idea of when a person dies, you just suddenly forget all the bad they did and only praise the good is kind of okay among friends and so on, but not okay when you're talking about politics where people made power decisions that radically altered our nation. I protested this guy for most of his life, and things I know about him that he shielded from others are things that I, as a journalist, kept trying to tell people. And a famous one is that George Herbert Walker Bush was in the CIA and lied about it while running for Senate. He was in the CIA and lied about it while running for office twice. And journalists asked him point blank, you have to remember this is when there were only, 3 networks and public TV and, maybe radio and print journalism. But he just outright lied about being in the CIA. And his connections to certain people during that time period just before that lend credence to the arguments that are made about how much Bush did covertly, George Herbert Walker Bush, which culminated in his act in that window, the October surprise, where he was illegally outside of the country negotiating with Iran and using weapons and drugs. We know this because of the Iran-Contra hearings. While in the window before he was vice president. So, here we go. Thank you. Friend Kent from SF is in Paris now. Says it's electric in the streets. Wow, fascinating. I would like to be there. But let me just finish this real quick about George H.W. Bush. This was a man that almost everything about the carefully painted picture that you're about to hear seems suspect to me. There were people who talked about the shooting, his being shot down and so on, as being stagey. The power that his father held to control where the sons or daughters went and what they did lends credence to that. And you need to read about Prescott Bush. Yay! I lost 100% of my viewers there, though. Is that Ann and Christopher? Are you guys still around? Wow, that was crazy. No, it wasn't that. It hit the hour mark, and right at the hour mark, it dropped out. So I'm guessing it's probably something like that. But the hour mark was supposed to be the point of a break, and a music break at that. I do want to finish talking about this. I am back, and thank you. I don't know what happened there. But it hit the hour mark, and I think my phone just didn't like going that long or something. Anyway, to return to the point of George Herbert Walker Bush. I am very familiar with the family, and I have studied them and covered stories about them for many, many years. I have run into that family in the 90s and in the 80s in Texas politics. At the University of Texas, I was a member of the student group that took the hotel room in the hotel that George H.W. Bush claimed as his residence while running for president of the country so he could woo over Texans. And we were the ones saying, this guy's not a Texan. And then he bought this reputation in Texas. I have come across his path umpteen times and in different situations. And his son as well. Sons, I should say. And for George Magazine, for example, a crazy thing happened I'll never forget with their family. But there's a story that I don't tell very often that I want to tell today on the passing of George Herbert Walker Bush. And, now telling it seems way worse than what it was then. You'll have to remember that in 1990 there was no internet, there was no cell phones, there were no digital cameras really weren't that much of a part of the deal, so film cameras. But I do believe there's a photograph of this moment in the Daily Texan in Austin, in the archives. George Herbert Walker Bush was President of the United States in 1990 and decided to come to the University of Texas to give the commencement address. So after all of this conflict I had had with him and with his family and with disagreeing with their politics, he would be delivering the commencement address to me and my fellow students in the political science and history department, and Plant Use Art, political science and history department at the University of Texas. Now, we don't do a walk across the stage thing because there's thousands of us. It's a huge university and a public state school and so on. We do a stand-up, now you've graduated, sit down kind of a deal. And he came, and I told friends, I'm like, look, we should all sit together and we should protest in some way, you know? And I was late or something happened. I forget how it worked out. I think I was late. And so I couldn't meet up with those guys. I ended up being alone. But I also was... I also had a bottle of champagne, right? So now I'm alone with a bottle of champagne in my cap and gown, about to graduate from University of Texas with my bachelor's degree. And George Herbert Walker Bush, a man who I have just very little respect for and who I had resisted for many, many years. You know, those stories we can talk about in days to come. I'm trying to learn how to talk about these guys when they pass away without the timing of it being an issue for more people. Because when I said stuff about John McCain the day after, everybody lost their minds. And I'm not going to be, if I'm going to keep the memories of these things as a journalist, that means I'm holding them as truths. I'm not holding them as just stories about my distaste for human beings. That's not what they're about. But there are facts in the middle of that, and one of them is this. So I have this bottle of champagne, and I'm alone, and they do a bunch of stuff before the President of the United States gets up to talk, right? Every dean and every blah blah has to have their moment. And during that, I'm kind of getting drunk, if I'm very honest with you. I'm drinking the champagne. And I'm giving it to people around me, too. I'm not just drinking the bottle alone. But finally, it comes time, and I decided I was going to do what I said I was going to do. So I stood during President Bush's speech like this. This is how I stood. Except I'm doing it low because you can't see it. I stood with the finger like this, and I had the bottle in my sleeve and my cap and gown on. Like that. I stood during the commencement address of my degree that I got from college. And the reason, or the person that induced that action by me died on Friday. And so I think the concrete way I wanted to say it today on the show was that was a perfect expression, as far as I'm concerned, about what I have to say on the passing of George Herbert Walker Bush. And I believe there's a photo of me, because I'm like the only one standing, you know. I think others stood. After I started doing it, I do believe others stood. The memory is a long time ago, and I wasn't. There were people around me who were like both laughing and some angry and whatever. And not really. No one cared in those days as much as they do now. There wasn't as much butt hurt as there is now. You know what I mean? And people saw it for what it was. And yeah, so that's a weird intersection I had with George Herbert Walker Bush that I'd like to share today as a cautionary, or kind of like, let's not go overboard these next few days praising this guy without a balanced review of what he did covertly. He did things covertly. Do you understand why I'm angry? I don't think you fully understand why I'm angry, but we're not going to do that today. It's too soon. Too soon. He's lying in state, right? And when the guy's lying in state, it's uncouth, isn't it? But I relate that story today because that happened. And it was weird. That was also a New World Order speech. It might have been actually one of the very first speeches, and it might be even one of the only ones he gave while he was in the White House that included the New World Order as a phrase. Yeah, I was very resistant to the Bush-Reagan era and remained that way, and it was a mistake. And the part 2 version of it was even worse because it was compounded by the gift, however you want to look at it, the manipulation of these of the attacks on our country that day. George Herbert Walker Bush, spy, deceiver. We don't know anything. Everything good you hear is probably just a mask. But he believed what he believed, and he lived it. You know, the secret society in him and the bones of Geronimo. You should look that up. At Yale. You know, he was a man who taught his sons and told people, he and Rumsfeld said that, you know what civilians were to George Herbert Walker Bush and Donald Rumsfeld? This goes back a ways. They referred to them as GFUs. You and I, because we're civilians, we're non-military, we are GFUs, which are gun fodder units, is what George Herbert Walker Bush and Donald Rumsfeld referred to civilians as. But you should look into his father, Prescott Bush, and the OSS and Dulles, and how much George Herbert Walker Bush was placed everywhere, and ask yourself, as you're listening to all this praise, you know, be critical, that's all I'm suggesting.